Welcome back, searchers and seekers, and we are in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 2. Again, Mark is really anonymous. We don't know who Mark was or where he wrote. Chapter 2, Jesus heals a paralytic in Capernaum, which is in Galilee. The house is surrounded by people, and they have to get a paralyzed man down in. They take apart tiles of the roof and lower him down. When Jesus sees their faith, he says to the paralytic son, "Your sins are forgiven." And that's really a surprising comment for a lot of reasons. First of all, what has this person done to really show faith? All of them, the men lowering him down and himself, had faith in the sense of persistence because they wanted him to be healed. So they were very much persistent in believing that Jesus might be able to heal him. But I'm not sure why that constitutes faith in a religious sense, and why that constitutes something that would make one's sins be forgiven. So for me, this is a story that is really incomplete and is not very telling. The other aspect is that there were people there who questioned that. It's like, who can really forgive sins but God alone? So this is really a dramatic turn of events, that Jesus is said to have forgiven sins, which is usually the prerogative of God alone. So that is a very important story, and we'll have to see where that lies. Jesus refers to himself as the Son of Man, and that goes mostly back to the Hebrew scriptures. Prophets sometimes refer to themselves as that. It is a term used in the Hebrew scriptures, in Hebrew and in Aramaic, I believe, and the precise meaning is not fully known. We don't know exactly what Mark or Jesus, if he really used this term, is meaning by it. And in response to the question of whether Jesus could forgive sins or not, Jesus performs a miracle and heals the man, as if to say he has the power to heal. He also has the power to forgive sins. So again, in Mark, we see the importance of miracle working. And Thomas Jefferson and other deists in the 17 and 1800s really looked askance at this kind of representation of Jesus as a miracle worker. And they sort of edited out that material and created more of Jesus who taught moral and spiritual lessons and was not a miracle worker. So that is something you can read in Thomas Jefferson's version of the Bible. There's a nice verse in chapter 2:17. When Jesus heard this, he said to them, "Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. I have come to call not the righteous, but sinners." And that's a very powerful phrase, but it also turns out that many philosophers of the age used a phrase like that. So that's really not an original phrase to Mark. It was used by other philosophers, and so it's not really original. In chapter 3, we have another discussion with those Pharisees and or scribes who have a problem with Jesus. This time it is because Jesus is healing on the Sabbath, which would be a day of rest. But Jesus responds by healing someone right in front of them and doing that good work. And yet they don't believe that, and they set out to plan to destroy Jesus. That's in chapter 3, verse 6. They conspired with the Herodians against him, how to destroy him. And the Herodians, we don't know exactly who that is, people who somehow supported Herod. So the question we might have here is, if Jesus is healing people physically right in front of the Pharisees, why are they not believing? Because that's pretty dramatic. Jesus seems to be a good person, and he's healing people right in front of them. Why would they plot to destroy him? And we'll see more, an answer for that in the next chapter or two. In chapter 3, verses 11 and 12, we see that whenever unclean spirits saw Jesus, they announce and shout, "You are the Son of God." And he orders them not to make that known. So again, we've seen this before, where unclean spirits or demons identify him as the Son of God. So he's a holy person, and sort of the Son of God individuates him as especially a holy person. But Son of God does not mean a divine being. Son of God just means a godly person. The word Son of God was applied to others in the Old Testament. It just means a holy person. It does not mean a literal Son of God. In verse 12, again, we have Jesus saying, warning them not to repeat that he is the Son of God. This is sometimes called Mark's messianic secret. Why is Jesus not wanting people to know who his true identity is? And we'll see this throughout Mark. I think the best answer, scholars talk a lot about this, and there are a variety of answers, but perhaps the best is Jesus in this gospel does not want to be known as the Messiah, because the Messiah is not, for Christians, going to be a political, kingly, military ruler, but the Messiah is going to be someone who suffers on the cross and dies. So the question is, that doesn't sound like a Messiah according to the traditional interpretation of Judaism. And that is why Jesus is sort of playing down the talk of the Messiah, because it will play into people's misconceptions about what the Messiah is for Christians, which is a crucified prophet, a crucified Jesus, Christ crucified. And also in chapter 3, verses 16 and on, Mark creates a list of the 12 apostles. But this list is different than other lists in the New Testament. There is major agreement on the first 8 or 10 or so, but then there's some differences in the list of the disciples. And 12 disciples were wanted in the text because that refers back to the 12 tribes of Israel. But there are differences in the texts. And Raymond Brown notes it was in about the year 150 that Justin, a theologian, I believe, refers to Peter's memoirs as containing a passage that is found only in Mark 3:16 and 17. So there are these different lists of apostles, and Justin in the year 150 or so refers to this list, this specific list, and we have it in Mark. That's the only place we know it exists, and he calls it Peter's memoirs. So when we say this is the Gospel of Mark written by Mark, we're not sure if this is Peter or Mark or whoever, but it is interesting that even in the year 150, this is not being referred to as the Gospel of Mark. Now, later in chapter 3, verses 21 to 23, around that area, we get the answer. Why did the Pharisees, why did some of the authorities not believe in these miracles? If in fact these miracles did occur, why would they doubt them? And part of the answer is this. They said he has Beelzebul, and by the ruler of the demons, he casts out demons. So he has Beelzebul, the leader of the demons, in him, or he's working with him. So that would be a reason why they did not believe the miracles as proof of Jesus' status. And Beelzebul it used to be translated Beelzebub, but it's Beelzebul is more accurate. And so Jesus responds to that. Well, that wouldn't make sense, because then Satan would be fighting against Satan, and no nation can survive when it's fighting itself. But that's the part of the answer of why the traditional authorities did not believe in the messiahship of Jesus. They would make this kind of argument. Now, are these healings, these exorcisms, are these nature miracles that Jesus is said to have done in Mark, are they historically valid? Can we support the historicity of these kind of miracle stories? And I would argue no, it doesn't. We can't really argue that. That would have to be purely a matter of personal faith. Personally, for me, I find them difficult to believe when written down decades and decades later by someone who did not even witness them. So that, if you have problems with the miracles, a lot of modern people do. In chapter 4, we have the parable of the sower. Jesus talks about a man who spread seed, and some of it goes on very rocky ground, doesn't really sprout. Some of it goes in the thorns and thistles, and it doesn't get enough sunlight, doesn't grow, and some other does. And many modern scholars think that this in chapter 4 is really early Christians talking amongst themselves and explaining to themselves why some people are not accepting the gospel. You could take it as a prophecy of Jesus about what's going to happen in the future, but many people think that because Mark was written 30 years after the death of Jesus or more, that this is really indicative of the experience of Christians as they're trying to evangelize, and they're finding many people do not believe, but some believe. So this is sort of words put in the mouth of Jesus to explain this contemporary experience of people not believing that he is the Messiah. In chapter 4, verse 15, there are seeds on the path where the word is sown. When they hear, Satan immediately comes and takes away the word that is sown in them. So here we have a very clear explanation of the role of Satan in Mark. And we see here that Satan is very active in the world and is sort of able to influence people's minds. So this is sort of dualistic in a way that the world is not just the creation, the shining creation of a God, but there's a spiritual battle between God and Satan is very active. In verse 17, the troubles or the persecutions are mentioned. And again, this goes back to the idea that when this story was written, there were persecutions. So this is, again, having Jesus say things that reflect the actual experience of contemporary Christians as they face persecutions, as they face people who don't believe because Satan takes away the word for them, and that the gospel is spread, but the seed does not always take root. And in verse 24, he said to them, "Pay attention to what you hear. The measure you give will be the measure you get, and still more will be given you." And that was, this verse is taken very seriously by Centers for Spiritual Living, a lot of the New Thought traditions. And the idea here is sort of the law of attraction, that what you have in your mind, in your spirit, is what's going to show up in your life. So in a sense, the categories with which you measure the world are going to be the categories that also impact you. So what you think about, what you meditate on, is what's going to appear on your path. So this was a verse taken to have that kind of spiritual meaning. And at the end of chapter 4, we have a nature miracle in which Jesus and some of the disciples are on a boat. The disciples wake up first. They notice the storm. It's terrible, and they are fearful. Jesus wakes up, rebukes them. He says, "Peace, be still," to the waters, and they still. So this is a nature miracle. And some scholars, some people, some Christians are willing to accept the healing miracles, but then they balk at these kind of nature miracles because they seem unbelievable. But some other Christians who really have a high Christology and believe in the absolute divinity of Jesus would say, well, no, God has absolute control over all of nature. So nature miracles would make sense. But again, here we have in Mark Jesus as a miracle worker, healing, exorcisms, and now nature miracles.